I'm glad to hear that. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you so you can go ahead and get us started on the presentation.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And thanks, everyone, for making time out of your day to be with us. So just to kick things off, if you're not familiar with Puppet, we're really leading a movement to change the way that software is delivered and operated. So for folks out there not familiar with us, today more than 2/3 of the Fortune 100 use our platform to really gain situational awareness and get the automation that they need to be able to drive software change with confidence. So the reason why we're here today is that most of our customers are really at some stage of adopting a DevOps way of working, and we're pretty fortunate to have the opportunity to work with these customers to learn how they're doing it, and then in turn also advise customers on ways to build the case and to get started implementing a DevOps practice based on what we've learned. So with that, I'd like to start things off by just running through a quick agenda for our time together today. We're going to kick things off by kind of sharing a roadmap that for implementing DevOps practices that we tend to see from our customers, and it really starts with hopefully giving you some ammunition to be able to build a business case internally for doing DevOps. Then we're going to walk through some of the cultural changes that we see our customers go through and undertake, as well as some of the key technical practices that underpin a DevOps initiative. And then lastly, I'll give you some advice on where to get started and some guidance on measuring the results and seeing if you were successful as well. So as Charlene mentioned, last but not least, we're going to have plenty of time to open things up to your questions. But before we do, we actually have a question for you all. So Charlene, I'm going to kick it back to you for our first poll question.
Yeah, sure. So as I said, there will be 3 polling questions throughout today's event. But here's the first one here, which is which best describes your organization's stage of DevOps adoption? And this is a really fascinating question to me, I think. We've got 4 choices for you to select, all the way from just starting thinking about it to trying to figure out what it is. So it's a really interesting question in that it really kind of will help us determine what that curve is for adoption right now, and I think that's going to be really fascinating to see with the results of that polling question. So we'll give you guys about 10 seconds more before we close it out, and as I understand, we're going to be tweeting out the poll results on DevOps.com, so please check your Twitter feed. And there are the poll results right there. So building the business case for DevOps is the secondary winner, but really right now, currently adopting DevOps practices and looking to scale is the clear winner in this particular poll. So that's really kind of interesting. Matt, what do you think about those results, Michael?
Yeah, I think first of all, not especially surprising based on what we tend to see in here when we get out and talk to IT organizations. And I think the good news is, given the fact that about 50% of you indicated that you're either at a stage where you're building the business case internally and trying to sell peers and management, or just trying to figure out what this thing really means. Hopefully, you'll walk away with some guidance on how to kick things off. And then for the other segment of you who indicated that you're looking to scale your implementation, hopefully some either guidance or reinforcement around some of the cultural changes and technical practices that perhaps you've already started to implement on your side. So thanks everyone for making time to give us some insight there. So, when we work with customers that are at, kind of that first category, if you will, in that poll question of trying to get their organization to buy into DevOps, we often find that people, don't necessarily buy what you do, but they buy why you do it, and that it's really important to kind of start with the why. In other words, what's the value or the benefit or the set of outcomes that you're actually hoping to achieve? And if you can align, senior management and peers on those desired outcomes, that's a better way of forging alignment across those groups. And while I'd argue that 2015 is the year that DevOps hit the mainstream, so to speak, I do feel like it's still somewhat of a loose and evolving collection of practices. And there's an old adage out there that if you walk into a room of 10 people and ask each of them to give you their definition of DevOps, you'll get 10 different responses, if not more. So at the risk of being that 11th person with a separate definition, to me at least, and what we tend to see from our customers is that DevOps is really a set of cultural and technical practices to help organizations improve the way that they work in order to deliver better software faster to their customers and end users. And I think one of the challenges that most organizations we talk to face is the need to really move faster without compromising the stability and reliability of their systems. I think a lot of IT teams these days are under a lot more pressure to increase the speed and the frequency with which they get new technology in the hands of their customers, while at the same time, striving to maintain high standards for availability and reliability of the applications and infrastructure that they're responsible for. And what we often hear is that there's, a perception out there that these goals of speed and reliability are opposing forces and that you can't get one without the other. So I want to kind of dig in on that a little bit because hopefully we've got some data that I'm about to share that will help debunk that, so to speak. And here at Puppet, we've pioneered the most comprehensive research on the state of DevOps for 5 years running. And if you haven't taken a look at this year's flavor of the report, which we released back in July, I definitely recommend giving it a read. This year we surveyed more than 9,000 IT professionals to really understand the key characteristics of high-performing IT teams. And the findings from this year's report really give some concrete numbers to underscore the value of adopting DevOps practices. So I'm going to give you some of the highlights now, and then we'll pop open a link on the screen toward the end of the webinar where you can go and download it directly. But over the past 5 years, what our data has shown pretty consistently is that these high-performing IT organizations that are implementing DevOps practices are not only moving faster, but they're also more agile. So on average, they deploy 200 times more frequently with better than 2,500 times faster deployment lead time or cycle time than their lower performing peers. But they're not just moving faster, they're also doing it without sacrificing stability and reliability. So what we found this year is that these high-performing teams have a change success rate that's 3 times higher than their lower performing peers. And if and when errors or outages do invariably occur, knock on wood, hopefully not too often, they actually recover from those issues 24 times faster. And then because they move security to the left, so to speak, and incorporate security teams and their requirements in the design phase of the software delivery process, what we're finding is that these DevOps organizations actually spend 50% less time remediating security issues than their lower performing peers. So we've also found that strong IT performance can really provide a meaningful competitive advantage. So within this year's DevOps report findings, we found that companies with high-performing IT organizations are 1.5 times more likely to exceed their profitability and productivity goals than their peers. And we also found that implementing DevOps practices actually even correlates with companies having 50% higher growth as measured by their market capitalization. So we were able to look at that for publicly traded companies where we could kind of dig into their financials. And then, in my opinion, one of the real understated benefits of doing DevOps is its impact on, for lack of a better term, just like employee happiness. And this year we found that DevOps practitioners are more than twice as likely to recommend their organization as a great place to work, and that DevOps teams actually get to spend more of their time on new and interesting work to the tune of 29% more time spent on innovation with 22% less time spent on, kind of unplanned rework or just kind of general firefighting maintenance type stuff. So if you're one of the people out there who answered that poll question earlier and said that you're at the stage where you're trying to build a business case internally for DevOps, my hope is that some of these stats will arm you with some tools for your back pocket to help convince peers and senior management within your organization that this is a set of changes that's going to be high impact to our business and help us be more competitive and successful in the market. So before we move on, I want to pop things back over to you, Charlene. I think we've got another poll question before we move on to some of the cultural changes that we see organizations implementing.
Yes, we do. This is the second of 3 polling questions. So here it comes right now. The question is, which benefits are driving your organization's interest in DevOps? This time we have 5 selections or answers to choose from. Improving speed and frequency of software delivery, improving stability and reliability of production systems, improving security of software releases, increasing company revenue and profitability, and improving employee satisfaction and retention. This really runs the gamut, so I really like this question. We'll give you guys about 10 to 15 seconds more to put your answer in, and then we'll take a look at the poll results very briefly, and then, as I said before, the poll results also will be tweeted out, so check your Twitter feed if you don't see what you want to see on the screen here before we move on. Okay, the results. Improving speed and frequency of software delivery, again, the winner, but followed very closely by improving stability and reliability of production systems. So, Michael, that seems like it's pretty much in tune with the results of the State of DevOps report as well, as far as why companies are adopting DevOps.
Yeah, definitely good insight there from folks who responded. So thanks for making time to do that. And I think, yeah, you're spot on, Charlene. Like, it seems to really back up that people who are interested in bringing DevOps practices into their organizations are trying to find ways to move faster, but also, just improve reliability of applications and systems and spend less time with the firefighting hat on. So that's good to see. Mm-hmm. It's also interesting to see I'm actually a little bit surprised so many people responded and said, security was that critical, nearly half of respondents. So that's good to see that folks are thinking about the security aspects of implementing, a DevOps way of working too. Cool. So we talked about, ways of building the business case and kind of convincing, others within your organization of the value of doing DevOps. And what I'd like to do is kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the cultural changes that we see our customers looking to implement. Here at Puppet, we definitely don't buy the notion that DevOps is just a single tool that you can just go buy or implement. It's really more about people and processes, with technology perhaps as an enabler of some of that process change. So let's dig into some of the cultural shifts that we see our customers focused on as they're implementing DevOps practices, and then some of the ways that they're organizing teams to actually facilitate better collaboration. So from a people perspective, most of our customers that are on a DevOps journey are really focused on moving their organizations from that of low trust and siloed teams and poor visibility and just a lack of alignment to one where they've got a high trust culture where teams are really working cross-functionally, where they're getting fast feedback and insight from customers and end users of the tech, and where everyone is really aligned around shared goals. And I think in order to do that, it really requires a culture of continuous improvement and a willingness to adapt and change from the management level down to the individual contributors. What we found this year in the State of DevOps report is that a DevOps initiative cannot be solely a top-down mandate, nor can it be a bottoms-up grassroots effort. It's really got to be kind of a blend or a mix of both. So when I talk to customers about their challenges with adopting DevOps, what they often cite is resistance to change as kind of that #1 barrier, if you will. But I would argue that the root cause isn't really resistance to change, but rather the way that people are incentivized to do their work. So when you think about the average organization, and I wonder if this sounds familiar to a lot of you on the call, oftentimes you've got folks on the business side who are incentivized to meet customer needs, and you've got development teams that are incentivized to deliver new features faster, and perhaps operations teams that care about keeping the systems running and ensuring the stability of systems that are running in production and applications running in production. Maybe you've got QA teams that are responsible for the quality of the software. And while ideally all of these teams work around that common set of goals, these incentives actually end up playing out to be fairly different and can lead to pretty different and somewhat siloed behaviors. So the cultural dynamic that we see at play among high-performing organizations is that all of these teams spanning the business, dev, ops, QA, security, etc., really all align around a common objective, which is how do we improve the way that we work in order to deliver the most value that we can to customers and to end users. So I'm curious, how many of you work in an organizational structure that maybe looks something like what you're seeing up here on the screen. This is an example from a financial services organization, but probably doesn't look too unfamiliar to many of you. This is pretty typical of large enterprise organizations where you've got perhaps different business units with developers residing in each of those BUs, and then you've got this monolithic enterprise IT function. And what we often hear is that this type of structure can result in multiple silos of pretty highly specialized individuals, which then leads to multiple handoffs being required to get changes into production, not to mention the risk of unique processes and tooling emerging among each of those silos, kind of every group having their own way of working and doing things, for example. And I get that silos exist for a reason and that they serve a purpose, but I do think we hear that they can also hinder communication and collaboration. So one of the questions we always get is how do we work around these silos and how do we evolve our organizational structure to try to facilitate better collaboration? So I'm going to walk you through 3 of the more common patterns that we see working well for some of our customers that have implemented DevOps practices. And I'll give credit to a gentleman named Matthew Skelton, who, if you haven't read his blog, has done a lot of really good research identifying the most common org structures for DevOps teams. And the first pattern that we commonly see is one in which Dev and Ops perhaps remain distinct teams but work closely together to deploy applications. So the idea here isn't that you've got developers doing operations work and operations writing application code, but rather for each team to have an awareness and an understanding of how their work impacts each other, and for there to be more shared responsibility across the software delivery lifecycle, meaning that developers have an understanding of what it takes to run applications in production and maintain them, and operations people have a voice in the software design phase of the delivery process, for example, kind of moving to the left, if you will. So in this model, what we often find is that devs can teach operations folks about agile development practices, and operations people can help developers understand how their apps are going to run in production. So we tend to see this approach or pattern working really well for perhaps smaller organizations with less complex orgs. But I think it's extremely important in this structure to have a common tool chain between developers and operations to be that common language and kind of facilitate better collaboration. So a second pattern that we often see for some of our larger customers, a good example being Salesforce.com, is what we'd call a cross-functional model. And these cross-functional teams really consist of representatives from all of the disciplines that are responsible for developing and deploying a service. So this might be business analysts and product owners and developers and quality engineers and some IT ops people and security, for example, where all of these teams are essentially fully empowered and self-sufficient. They're the ones that are identifying collectively the requirements, they're designing the solution, they're writing it, they're testing it, and they're deploying that application or service. And what we find is that these teams are more efficient because there are fewer handoffs, there's forced collaboration for that specific product line or business unit, and we often see, again, this approach most commonly successful in organizations that have distinct product lines or business units that don't share a significant number across other lines of business. So the last common approach that we see from an org structure perspective that I'll buzz through is, this is particularly common among larger enterprises, is establishing a dedicated DevOps team to build the model for the rest of the organization, so to speak. And often this team consists of developers with experience managing applications and systems in production, as well as operations people who have some experience with agile software delivery, practices. And the goal of this team is really to identify the cultural and technical processes and practices to implement, and then pilot the process and technology changes necessary to adopt, a more mature DevOps way of working. So what these teams often do is build self-service platforms and focus on implementing, continuous delivery type methodologies that we'll talk to you in a few minutes. And another big part of their role is really around coaching and training other teams on how to do things like Agile and continuous integration and version control and automation and what types of cultural changes you're trying to achieve that will enable better success. What I will say with this approach is one of the risks with this pattern is if it simply becomes another silo within a large organization. So that's why you generally want to see an expiration date for this dedicated team. They're the ones kind of building the template, if you will, for how development and operations teams can improve the way that they work to meet the needs of customers. But you don't want this to become yet another silo within the organization that has their own way of working that's not representative of the rest of the company. So switching gears a little bit to, from the culture to some of the technical practices that we see, most of our customers are employing continuous delivery type practices across the organization from the dev side through to operations. And in this year's State of DevOps report, we found that there are really 4 key practices that serve as kind of prerequisites, if you will, for continuous delivery. One of which is really focused on automating manual work. And that notion of automation includes things like automating infrastructure configuration through to automated testing and application deployments. A second key practice that we see is implementing a trunk-based continuous integration approach to really enable teams to regularly integrate code into a shared repository, but also have the ability to kind of break up the once a year or twice a year monolithic releases, if you will, into perhaps smaller but lower risk and more frequent releases that enable quicker feedback from end users so you can ultimately improve the product in the spirit of continuous improvement. A third enabler that we see from a tech practices perspective is for application developers as well as the operations folks to employ a consistent set of version control practices. And really the goal there is to have, to give both teams a common and central repository, both for application code as well as infrastructure code, and then to enable those teams to more easily collaborate and iterate and roll back when necessary. And then last, it's not expressed directly on the slide, but we've also found that peer review is a real key enabler of delivering better software faster, as opposed to forcing all changes through kind of a monolithic change approval board that might hinder your ability to roll out, new applications or services on a more frequent basis. And together what we find is that a lot of these practices will lead to benefits like less deployment pain and faster and more frequent deployments and higher change success rates that ultimately have better reliability. So from a technology perspective, I think I've shared our belief here at Puppet that DevOps is really about, culture and process change, but technology can be a key enabler of some of that process change. And we do commonly see a blend of tools that are used by our customers to help enable a DevOps way of working. So these include things like automated configuration management and application deployment tools and orchestration capabilities. It also includes things like version control and continuous integration tools that are out there, as well as monitoring and logging tools, both at the core infrastructure as well as the application levels of the stack, so to speak. So we put just a few example tools for each category here on the screen, but I'm certainly under no delusions that this is an exhaustive list. You may be using some of these today within your environment. There very well are likely others out there too that can fit into each of these buckets, if you will. So Charlene, I want to pause here and open things up to another polling question. I think we're going to dig into which of these technologies some of you out there are currently using.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. So yeah, this is the final of the 3 quick polls that we have during today's webinar. And the question is, which of the following tools does your team currently use? And this is a select all that apply question. So we've got, again, 5 choices. We've got version control, configuration management, continuous integration, automated deployment, and monitoring. So go ahead and get your answers in for this final poll. And I also want to remind the audience that if you do have a question for Michael about any part of this webinar, if you do have a question, please feel free to go ahead and submit it at any time. We are going to have plenty of time for questions at the end, and we've had a lot of questions come in so far, so we want to make sure that we're able to get to as many questions as we can. So please don't wait to get your questions in, and we'll give you guys about 10 more seconds here to go ahead and make your choices here, and then we'll close it out and we'll take a quick look at the results. And then also, again, the results will be tweeted out as well. So here are the results. Looks like version control is the clear winner here. Continuous integration is a second, and then configuration management and automated deployment both are neck and neck basically in third place. Monitoring is the final one. So Michael, in your interactions with your customers, again, does this kind of jive with what you're hearing out there?
Yeah, I think that's a real interesting insight from folks on the call. So thanks again for participating in that. I think one of the things that doesn't surprise me is the number of you out there that have kind of a mature, sophisticated use of version control and source control. That's pretty foundational. Monitoring obviously being important as well to understand infrastructure and application performance. And I think we're seeing a rise in the use of automated practices for automating infrastructure configurations as well as orchestrating distributed deployments of applications. But still an area where more of you I think have yet to perhaps dig in. So yeah, thanks again everyone for participating. It's always good to see where folks are at and where your organization currently sits. So switching gears a little bit, we've talked a lot about ways of building the business case. We've talked about some of the cultural changes and ways of structuring teams and aligning incentives, and then a little sneak peek into some of the common technical practices and tooling that a lot of high-performing DevOps organizations are implementing. Love to just provide some quick guidance on where to get started. And what we often find as companies begin thinking about implementing these practices and getting the supporting tooling in place is that infrastructure as code winds up being a pretty key enabler that serves as a foundation for a mature DevOps practice. So when you treat your infrastructure as code, it becomes possible to implement a lot of the practices that we just covered and do things like bring agile practices from software delivery into the infrastructure as well. So for example, when infrastructure configurations can be treated as code, they can be expressed as flat text files, and you can check them easily into a version control system for collaboration. And when infrastructure is, human readable, for example, it becomes that common language across teams that helps drive collaboration regardless of what portion of the infrastructure you work on. And it helps enable practices like peer review, as well as ensuring consistency across dev, test, and production environments, which is a pretty key prerequisite for continuous delivery, ultimately with the goal of helping your teams become more agile and your systems, more reliable. So what we often find our customers tell us is that these practices kind of collectively enable benefits like fast feedback loops and the ability to iterate quickly and better collaboration between dev and ops teams as they begin standardizing on a common set of processes and tools, as well as better visibility just into application performance and kind of what's going on and changes that are taking place, sort of exposing that black box, if you will. These are the things that we often see as key to becoming an agile, lean organization that continuously learns and improves. So as for the folks out there, I think there were about 50% that are at some kind of early stage of building the business case or trying to figure out what this DevOps thing really means. As you start to bring some of these practices into your organization, one of the things I would encourage you to do is think about how you're going to measure success. And there are obviously a lot of different ways to measure success. We talked through some of the key benefits that we commonly see from high-performing IT organizations earlier on. But just as a simple starting point, I would recommend just some basic metrics to start to look at, kind of benchmarking for before and after. really around speed or throughput as well as reliability. So you'll see things like deployment frequency and change lead time or deployment cycle times, for example, change fail or success rates, mean time to recovery, and overall kind of availability or uptime for key applications and services, as ideally being some of the metrics where you'll see improvement as you bring these practices into your organization. And by measuring them, before and after, that's a great way to see what's working and help kind of prove to management or to others within your organization that this is a set of practices that we should scale up within our organization because it's adding real value. So just some advice on ways to get started. I know, as Charlene mentioned, we've got some questions coming in from the group. Want to leave plenty of time for that. What I'll leave up here on the slide for folks during the Q&A portion is just some recommended reading. I obviously threw out a lot of stats at everyone from Puppet's 2016 State of DevOps report, so you can find a link to download the report directly up on the screen here off of our website. And then just some recommended reading, and by no means is this an exhaustive list, but if you're looking for some more long-form content, The Phoenix Project by Gene Kim is a real seminal piece in the DevOps space. And then Jez Humble wrote a couple really good books that I enjoyed. I started with Continuous Delivery, but he also wrote another book called Lean Management that I thought provided a lot of the cultural insight that a lot of high-performing IT organizations are looking to implement. So would recommend that one as well. So with that, Charlene, I'll kick things back to you to see what questions we have from folks on the call.
Yeah, great. So we've gotten some really good questions in so far, so we'll get to those. But I also do want to encourage the audience, if you haven't put your questions in, please feel free to do so. There's still time. And we want to make sure that you guys get everything out of the webinar that you're looking for. So do not be bashful. Please get your questions into Michael. We've got a really great question here to kick things off from Ian, who's asking, how does application release automation come into play with DevOps? And then what tooling or solution recommendations do you have?
Sure thing. Yeah, that's a great question. So we talked about kind of the tool chain earlier on. What I often hear, and obviously this is totally different, I'm sure, for different organizations, but one of the common threads we hear is that application deployment processes themselves are one of the biggest bottlenecks around just getting software out in production. A lot of organizations complain of manual processes that are pretty error-prone, or of needing a lot of human intervention to get applications deployed in production. And the other challenge with app deployments is, your average kind of distributed application probably has a lot of underlying dependencies, supporting services that need to be up and running in a specific order and share configuration information with each other in order to enable that application to run the way it's supposed to. So that might be things like a database service or a web server or a load balancer, for example, all of which need to be coordinated to be deployed and configured in a certain way and running in a certain order. And so that makes manual approaches to app deployments pretty problematic if you haven't accounted for all of those dependencies. And so I think that's really given rise to the application release automation space, and then also other tools like, provide a short plug, but by no means am I here to just talk about Puppet. But this is certainly an area where Puppet is helping our customers as well, as providing that unified solution to help you automate the delivery and operation of all of your software, regardless of whether that's the core infrastructure, middleware, or the actual applications that run on top of that infrastructure.
Awesome. All right, great. Thanks, Michael. Next question here is from Matt, who's asking, where do Agile practices fit into a DevOps way of working? A little more general here.
Yeah, good question, Matt. I would say that what we often hear is that Agile software development practices that have been pretty commonly used for probably the last 10 or 15 years are starting to kind of bleed more into the operations side of the house around infrastructure is provisioned, configured, delivered, and operated on an ongoing basis. And what we often hear when we consult our customers around DevOps is that if they've complained of development and operations side of the house being super siloed and not collaborating particularly well with each other, when there's an acknowledgement that both sides of the house are implementing an agile way of working, using some of the technical practices that we talked through on this webinar, it ends up being a way of forging alignment across teams, because you've got that kind of common approach that both operations as well as developers are using to get software up and running and deployed. And so we see Agile being one of those common frameworks that helps actually forge alignment across teams, and is pretty critical to implementing, a DevOps way of working and getting some of the benefits around, getting software released faster with more reliability, and also just getting fast feedback from end users and customers so you can iterate and improve the product, if you will.
Great. All right. Excellent. So the next question then is from Manuel, who's asking what hosted CICD, so continuous improvement, continuous delivery tools, do you recommend? So he said, I know the answer depends on the infrastructure, but nowadays people talk a lot about CICD using pipeline as a first class. So do you have any suggestions?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question, Manuel. I would say that most of our customers, I can certainly advise on what I tend to see and hear from our customers, and most of them that are using a continuous integration tool to automate builds and tests are using tools like Jenkins by CloudBees. That's a pretty popular one. But we also see Travis CI, TeamCity, Atlassian has a CI tool as well that our customers commonly use as well. And I'm not certainly not in the business of providing recommendations for one versus another. It really depends on what you're looking to do and kind of your specific needs and the tooling that perhaps your organization's most comfortable with. For a lot of organizations that are looking to bring continuous integration practices into operations, they might look at what the development side of the house has used for continuous integration pipelines and workflows, and if there's a specific tool in place there, they might adopt that on the ops side as well, just for consistency and standardization. So that tends to be the most common set of tools that we see our customers most commonly implementing.
Awesome. All right. Great. We've got a flurry of new questions coming in, so let's go ahead and keep things rolling. The next question is from, and I apologize if I kill your name, but it's Teja Sweeney, I think, Teja Sweeney, who's asking, what do you mean by dev and ops teams working together? He says, so let's say there's some test failure in one of the deployments. Which team is going to take responsibility for it? Ops team writes application code?
Yeah, good question. We definitely don't see, or I think. Sure, we definitely don't commonly see, nor do we recommend operations people actually writing application code. But I think one of the common areas of feedback that I hear is developers write some application code and kick it over the wall to ops and say, hey, deploy this. And if there are bugs in the application code, or if the application doesn't run in production as intended because perhaps it worked on somebody's development workstation, operations being kind of left having to troubleshoot singularly and figure out what the problem is. And what we tend to see from a cultural perspective is when implementing a DevOps way of working, it's important for shared responsibility to exist across teams, where you see development folks that have a better understanding of what it's going to take to maintain applications in production, and they have that fast feedback loop with the operations folks around any issues that might occur in production, so you can fix them quickly and improve that mean time to recovery. But then also giving operations folks an understanding of how software is actually written and developed, so they can bring some of those practices into how they manage the underlying infrastructure and get that up and running faster and more reliably. So I think there's kind of a shared set of responsibilities there, where you blend, if you will, the visibility into the software delivery process for both of those teams, but it doesn't mean that operations people are writing application code and developers are deploying their own applications by themselves and maintaining them on their own in production.
I think DevOps is also, one of the tenets is no finger pointing. So make it something that, like you said, that shared responsibility. So good answer there. Okay, so the next question is actually, I'm sorry, did you want to follow up?
Oh, I was just gonna back that up, Charlene. I think that's a great point. And we didn't talk about this during the webinar, but one of the other common cultural practices we see is the notion of, our customers often call it blameless postmortems. I prefer the term blameless retrospective because ideally nobody died, but
right.
the idea,
let's hope not.
The idea there being, let's hope not. The idea there being, if something goes wrong or something unexpected happens, that's a shared responsibility across the entire team. And so I think there's real value in adopting that kind of blameless culture, where you're focused on continuous improvement and not at pointing fingers for, well, this team did this certain thing wrong.
Right, right. Good point, good point. Okay, so Ian has a follow-up question, and that is, what tools does Puppet have for deployment of applications?
Sure thing. Yeah, good question, Ian. So this is an area where Puppet's really invested from a product perspective and a development perspective over the course of the last couple of years. So today we offer tools to help our customers really kind of model and automate the deployment of distributed applications. And the way that it works, without getting into too much detail, is really taking all of the things that Puppet historically has been known for around helping our customers automate the delivery and operation of core infrastructure and extending that up the stack. So using Puppet, we've got a lot of our customers these days that are actually modeling the desired state of how they want a distributed application to look and how it should be running in production in a way that accounts for all of the dependencies across that application at kind of the middleware and core infrastructure layers of the stack. And they use Puppet as that kind of single tool to to automate the delivery and operation of all of that software. So it's, again, a newer area of focus for Puppet over the last couple of years, but something we're increasingly seeing interest and adoption from our customer base around. And happy to follow up offline, Ian, if that's a topic of interest for a further discussion.
All right, I bet Ian's happy about that. Okay, next question is kind of a FUD question from John, talking about the fear, uncertainty, and distress when it comes to DevOps. And his question is, if the culture change stumbling block revolves around fear of being automated out of a job, how do you overcome that challenge?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'll actually channel a Gartner analyst named Ronnie Colville, who delivered. I was at a Gartner event a few months ago, and she delivered a talk about this very topic. And her contention or thesis was that automation doesn't replace people's work. It makes people's work more strategic, and that you will always need highly skilled people to set the strategy and manage the automation. And we even see that among our customers, right? I mean, Puppet is an automation solution. We've got customers that are experts in Puppet that are, writing Puppet code, for example, to automate infrastructure and application configurations and managing that on a day-to-day basis, and Puppet being kind of that common language to automate the delivery and operation of all their software. And so what we really don't see automation replacing people's work. We see it as doing two things, one of which is making people's work more strategic, giving them more time back in their day to focus on innovation or improving the business, or even just being able to leave the office and go get a beer at 5 o'clock and not having your pager go off on weekends. That tends to be the more common outcome that we see. So yeah, I would say anyone who suggests that automation might replace people's work, that's simply not something that I'm seeing playing out in the real world.
Okay, all right, great. Hopefully that can put folks' fears to rest in that area. Okay, so next question then is from Amit, and he is asking, The tools and processes we associate with DevOps were already there before DevOps came into the picture. So what difference is DevOps bringing in?
Yeah, good question, Amit. I would say that a lot of the tooling that we talked about earlier on in the webinar have existed and have been most prominently perhaps used among software development teams historically. A lot of software development teams have been using, have been implementing Agile practices where continuous integration, pipelines and associated tooling have been in place for a while. A lot of software development teams have been using source control or version control for quite some time. I do think what we commonly hear is a lot of these practices and associated technologies are perhaps a little bit newer on the operations side. And it's good to see that folks on the webinar, when we did the polling question, a majority were using some combination of the tooling that we described within that DevOps tool chain. But from a collaboration perspective, when you can get operations and development folks that have that consistent and common set of practices and technologies that they use to get software out in production and maintain it over time, that ends up really facilitating collaboration. And so I think there's still more work to be done from a DevOps adoption perspective to get operations and dev folks aligned around automation and continuous integration and version control and automated deployment and a consistent approach to monitoring as well.
Okay, great. Moving on, like I said, we have a ton of questions here. Keith is asking, is Puppet integrated into Windows deployments?
Yeah, good question, Keith. It is. We've got, I would say, a significant portion of our customers use Puppet to automate Windows environments, and there's a whole set of Windows workloads, for example, that we offer pre-built kind of modules of configuration code to be able to easily get started day one automating with Puppet. And Windows is really a first-class citizen for us, given the fact that we have so many customers with heterogeneous or mixed environments or heavy Windows environments that they're looking to automate with Puppet. So that's a core focus for us from a product and innovation perspective.
Great. All right. Okay. Let's see. I want to remind folks that if we don't get to your question today, I'm sure that Michael will be more than happy to answer questions offline, get back in touch with you. But we do have a couple more minutes for questions, so let's just go ahead and keep right on rolling here. Sergio is asking, what is the best approach when trying to introduce DevOps to a traditional enterprise? And how do we quantify how many changes must happen into this type of organization?
Yeah, good question, Sergio. I would say that we talked earlier on about how it's really important to start with the why, and as you're trying to build that case, don't immediately dig into here's all of the technical practices we want to implement in the tooling, but the way you get buy-in, particularly from senior management, is aligning around the problems you're trying to solve or address, the desired outcomes you're looking to achieve, and really the value that you expect to see. So, provided some ammunition early on around ways that doing DevOps can improve speed and quality of software delivery, help you innovate faster, improve reliability, actually help organizations compete better and win in the market, and then also the impact on employee retention. In terms of actually getting started then, what we commonly see is our customers focus on going out and doing an inventory across the organization of where the biggest pain points are that they're looking to solve. And for some of them, that might be, simple just lack of communication altogether between different groups within operations or between development and operations, for example. For some groups, it may be that their app deployments are particularly slow and painful and error-prone, or that the core infrastructure, they're not able to configure it, and changes take place that are unexpected, and that ends up a box that causes production downtime, for example. So it really depends on the organization, but I would say it's important to put together a cross-functional team to get together and have a real dialogue about what are the biggest pain points in the organization that you're looking to solve, aligning around the objectives you're hoping to achieve, and then backing in from there to, solidifying kind of the cultural component that you're trying to change, as well as the technical practices that make sense for your organization.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, doing a time check here. We got about 7 or 8 minutes left here, so I think we've got time for 2 more questions. Karthik is asking, based on your experience, are there any business use cases where both Puppet and Docker can be used collaboratively?
Yeah, great question. I would say we see that a lot. Many of our customers, and it's a growing number as well, are either currently using Docker, either in development or testing or production environments, or they're planning to use Docker. And what we frequently see is our customers often tell us that they see Puppet and automation as kind of their bridge to the future, if you will. That when our customers are looking to move workloads from bare metal physical servers into the cloud, for example, they see automation as a way to help them get there faster and to kind of enable portability, and also just have consistency across how infrastructure is managed, regardless of whether it's on physical servers or virtual machines or in the cloud, for example. And increasingly, we're seeing our customers that are looking to use Docker or currently using containers in development or production environments, seeing Puppet as a standard way to automate the container build process, for example, and ensure that the Docker daemon is configured correctly, and ensuring that the containers are going to run in production the way that they're intended, and that you've got a consistent approach for managing all of your infrastructure and the applications that run on top of them. So we've introduced a bunch of tooling over the past, I would say, year and a half or so to work with Docker. We work pretty closely with the Docker team on kind of joint ways of working together to meet the needs of mutual customers, and so a lot more there that we could speak to offline that I think just due to time we'll keep pretty high level.
All right, great answer. Okay, so we've got, I think, time for one more question here. Mohammed is asking, what is the best way to bring infrastructure under automation to make infrastructure as a service?
The best way to bring infrastructure, to basically start to automate infrastructure, I think was the question, Mohammed?
I believe so, yes. I believe that's the question he's asking.
Yeah, good question. So, a lot of our customers that get started with Puppet and automation are generally either using some kind of a patchwork of tools, off-the-shelf tools perhaps to manage infrastructure, or more commonly, they're primarily either managing it manually, or some folks on the team have written some one-off custom scripts in perhaps Bash or PowerShell to be able to automate portions of the infrastructure. And what we often recommend in terms of getting started with Puppet is really starting at the core kind of operating system level configurations, automating resources like firewall and DNS and network time protocol, for example, just kind of simple stuff at the operating system level where perhaps you have any kind of bigger pain points, and then building the automation practice from there to middleware, things like your web servers and your database services and load balancers, for example, and kind of that level of the stack. And then we commonly see our customers then continue to scale their automation practice, moving up the stack to actual applications where they look to use tools like Puppet or other tools out there as well to automate the deployment and management of the actual distributed application in a way that accounts for all of the underlying dependencies that need to be up and running for that application to deploy and operate in production successfully. So I think starting with the core infrastructure, kind of OS level configurations, moving up to middleware and then to distributed applications is the approach that we tend to see most commonly pursued among our customers, at least.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Michael. Just a reminder, folks, if we did not get to your question, we do have a record here of all of the questions that were asked, so I'm sure we'll be doing some follow-up after the event. But looking at the time, I think we're going to have to close out the question and answer period. But Michael, thank you very much for tackling some of those questions, all of those questions, some of which were, I'm sure, a little more difficult than others, at least for me. So.
No, those were great. Always good to see the engagement from the audience, and appreciate everyone making time to be with us today.
Yes, great. Well, I do want to thank you, Michael, for taking the time and being on the webinar today. I had so much useful information. I'm sure the audience got a lot of it, a lot out of it. So thanks very much for joining us, and thank you, the audience, for joining us today. And please don't forget to check on the DevOps.com website for upcoming webinars that we have scheduled. And for now, I guess it's up to me to say thank you again, and hope to see you next time.